Haidong! In this video, we're going to talk about Chakgum of Iban's put away. This is going to be the second put away. So the first one was simply just a coming back with a crosscut. This is where things get a little bit different, right? So it's not merely, so for example, again, the end of one is simply bang, kick it back. I might potentially make a video with that, but it's a very straightforward concept, versus number two is going to look something more like this, right? So if you focus, roll, and then from there, you're going to have your put away. Make sense? Briefly, what is the purpose of a put away? So this is not merely the actual act of sheathing the sword. This is also getting the blood away from specifically like the hilt and the guard, right? So the idea behind this so during a form, we have, for example, number two, we have that roll, and then we put the sword away, right? So in actuality, so if you were actually in combat, you would not probably do this and merely do this to put the sword away. You would have a lot more to clean the blade before you're actually sheathing the sword. So then what's the purpose of doing this with a sword, right? So like if you also think about some of the other ones, so like for example number four does that, and we have a few others that kind of look more flourishy than necessarily useful. So what's the purpose of, again, rolling the blade before putting the sword away? I mean, I already mentioned it, but again, it's to get the blood away from the hilt. So probably one of the worst things you can probably do for a sword, if you're as consistent about it, is if you have like moisture or blood or anything like that going into the actual hilt, right? So especially if you don't take your sword apart often or at all, if you have any gooey stuff, or especially blood that's going to help really oxidize the sword that's on the inside, it's going to weaken your sword. So especially if you're making contact with that sword, which allegedly you were doing back in the day because combat, that's going to obviously shorten the length of the life of your sword. It's just not going to be good. Versus if you're able to get the blood away, so again in this case using centrifugal force, right? So kind of like to push again blood away from like the center of the spin. From there, obviously you would not just like, oh, blood is away from the hilt, I'm going to sheath it, because now all that gore that's on your sword is now going to be inside your scabbard, which isn't good, right? So that's not going to be helpful for your sword, which is another reason, so this is going to be a side note, right? So if you do like throw cutting with apples or something like that, or anything that has any sugars in it, make sure you actually clean the sword before put the sword away. Because you don't want any of that fructose or any of that sugars in your scabbard once you start like sheathing the sword away. Sheathing the sword, because then it's going to consistently get that dose of sugar, which is going to cause it to rust. But, so again, let's just imagine we just finished combat, right? So again, end of form two, I just either cleared away, or I knock someone's knee out, and I'm coming back in defense, and I'm putting the sword away. So again, this is getting the blood away from the guard or from the hilt. And actually in actual combat, from here, I would actually wipe the blade down. So in this case, I would probably have a cloth or a tenugui if you're more into the Japanese, right? And from there, I would actually actively wipe it down, right? And then once I know that's clean, again, I would probably put this actually in my sleeve as opposed to up in here. But imagine we just did that. So now that I've completely cleaned the blade, then I put the sword away. Making sense? So it's actually a whole process to actually sheathe your sword if you want to have, again, a nice longevity to it, especially if you're going into combat, but we're not. Right? So I'm assuming most of us are not actually going to have blood covering our swords, but we actually need to have a complete wipe down session every single time. So this is kind of like a nice shortcut. So this is kind of like a heuristic that we have at the end of our forms, just to kind of say like, all right, so remember all that good stuff on your sword. Just imagine, like this is like a shortcut of thinking. Imagine you're cleaning the blade off, and now you're good. So let's get started on actually learning how to do this put away. So again, this is Chakgum of Iban, our second form. So if we're here, right, I'm going to start facing off this way. As always with the first couple forms, again up through seven, you actually have what we call a focus. All that means is I have the sword centered up. I'm feeling the weight of the sword this way. So again, I can go into what the focus is a little bit more, but the general idea right now is just feeling the weight of the sword, getting tuned with the sword. So I'm just holding the blade out like so. So from here, again, I'm grabbing my sword, or grabbing my scabbard, making sure I have the scabbard upright, so again, I can feel the knot on my sword here. From here, so again, what it's going to look like is something like that. right? And then you're going to put the sword away. So how do we get to that point? So first, I recommend just learning how to just roll, right? If you want to have a tighter fist, you can. Notice that I actually had a little bit more of an open. I was mostly just pinching these two, right? If you want, again, just open, roll, roll, roll. Again, facing forward, roll. And notice I'm kind of close to my body, but it's not like so close I'm going to hit my head or hit my shoulder or anything like that. It's just rolling this way. Again, you have a tighter fist if you want, but you're going to have a lot more work to do if you're going to be doing that spin. Again, so yarn, right. So then from here, the idea is you're actually going to try to like smear that roll a little bit more, right? So again, if you're not used to the roll as much, all you need to do is here, kind of like let it drop so your hand is up, so you have a palm, and eventually kind of use your momentum here, drop, roll. And eventually you can just get it to a nice rhythm with a roll. So again, in general, you don't want to do this in combat because spins generally just don't help you that much, right? So I know in some martial arts we use spins kind of like speed up a cut or a strike, which usually you can do with just a normal, just like, right, so a little bit more flick in your strike as opposed to like rolling striking. But again, this is not to augment a cut. It's not meant to, again, merely look pretty, although it will. Right, so from here, again, if you're used to just a normal roll back, right? So notice that my hand is actually still pretty much outstretched. So I'm not going to be here doing it, because notice that first of all I might hit my shoulder with the bottom of the sword, right? So just a nice roll, roll, right? And then eventually, here, as the blade is coming up this way, right? So as it's kind of ascending here, so instead of just letting my wrist stay where it is, right? So notice that my wrist is staying more or less where it is if I just do a normal spin. Here, as the sword is coming up this way, I'm actually going to raise my hand up this way. So from here, roll up, roll up, roll up, right? So now obviously this is going to be a little bit of a shoulder exercise too, right? So you might feel a little more on your shoulder. Ideally you feel more in the deep shoulder because you're engaging more of a deep shoulder. But this is, because especially if you're using like a metal sword, this will get tiresome pretty quickly. But again, roll up, roll up, roll up. And then eventually I'm going to go back a little bit more. So facing you actually. So roll up, roll up, roll up. So from here, roll up, down, right? Roll up, down, here, here. Once again, roll up, down, roll up, down. So, one might ask, okay, why don't I just do this to put away, right? Yeah. So, what's actually going to be happening is, so imagine like, again, the acceleration. So this doesn't have that much acceleration once it gets started, right? It's just meh, meh. It's like it's pretty constant velocity, right? Which means the acceleration is pretty much zero. Versus, if I have that oomph here is actually going to be using the momentum of your sword, so you actually don't need to do that much effort yourself. You're actually going to be using the weight of the sword to give it some jerk, so some increase in acceleration, right? So here, it's pushing up, which means with that increase in acceleration, again, there's a little bit of a jerk, so an increase in acceleration means an increase in velocity eventually, which means it gets a little more centrifugal force, which means more blood is going to be dragged away from the center part, right? So again, here, boop. So imagine that upward motion, right? So where it go from stationary to up, imagine that part is where you're actually getting most of the blood away from your hilt. This part's just kind of getting the motion started, right? So again, getting motion, and then bang, to really get the blood away from the hilt. And from there, again, wipe, and then Chakgum. But again, facing forward one more time. Bum, bum. Again, if you're into the Federation put away, bum, on a nice, like 30-degree angle, again, using your left hand to drop back and put away. If you're weird like I am, and I like to have the horizontal, that's also the same thing you can do there as well. So both of those would be fine. But again, think about the actual use of the put away. Now you could also do this a little bit more closed fist. That's going to be a little bit weirder, and it's actually a little bit more dangerous. So let's take a look, right? So if I do closed fist, you can still use your left hand, or not left hand, you can still use, again, pinky ring middle to give yourself that extra jerk, but it's going to be a little bit more dangerous, right? So instead of here, where I have a lot more control over it, the more closed fist you are, it's going to jerk more towards your temple, right? And it actually might hit your forearm, which is flexing because you're trying to maintain that grip. So you can have a closed fist version. It's going to be actually pretty damaging to your wrist if you do that a lot, maybe even to your elbow because you're twisting it in a way that really is intended. Versus if you have your open, again, pinching this way, it's a little bit more okay, right? Right? So because that's actually going to like let the blade kind of stay on its own angle. So notice I can actually pretty much spin it on this line, right? This way. So that way, notice if I close my fist, my elbow kind of does this motion, right? So yes, you can do this with a closed fist, but it's going to damage your elbow in the long run. But yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it, right? So it's a pretty simple move, all things considered. There's nuances to it that I would recommend. I've also seen some people engage their body a little bit more, right? So if we're in that position, I've seen some people go like, right? Or the lower and come up. I feel like that's going to be actually, again, a little bit more dangerous because you're kind of doing several things at once. And it also looks a little bit silly, but I'd rather have my focus on this one thing, right? Making sure I can blow it out that way, because this portion isn't going to give you that much more, again, oomph to the put away. So I'd recommend, again, maintain your chiante, right? So probably a better chiante than that, bun, and work from there. Drills, right? So obviously practice this, right? So practice both versions, or actually several different versions. So try just the normal, right? Like almost like you're just coming across your body this way, almost like a figure eight. Give that a go, see what happens, right? You might notice that it's not really getting any acceleration away, right? Try also, again, the more standard way. Try it, again, closed fist, right? Kind of see what's going on. Closed fist rising, right? So again, try all these different versions, right? Eventually you can do like backwards figure eights and stuff like that. But that's not really the main purpose of this, right? But also try a slight variation. So we used to do this, so it's not true anymore, but we used to do this in Sangsu 10, where you can actually step with it. I'm actually going to step back. You're actually going to start low, and then roll up. Make sense? So again, starting low, stepping up, 1, 2, 3. So that's going to have an extra half spin, that way. Right? And you're rising the entire time. Make sense? So just for a drill, right? So that's going to be almost exclusively, again, pinching grip as opposed to closed fist grip. But it's just something to try, right? So it looks a little bit fancier, adds some, extra flourish to it, but it's a little more dangerous and doesn't really, again, do that much more than actually this way. Because notice the jerk is actually not that much. The jerk will be way down here, and then you have constant acceleration after that. Versus for us, we have that jerk at the end, and then from there we can, again, wipe the blade down. So they both have their own uses, but just something to keep in mind. As usual, stay safe, right? So again, COVID. So stay safe, stay humble, and keep training. Haidong!